Hey gang, with it being Alien Week and 4.2 maybe dropping by the time I drop this vid, here's a little thought experiment. In my previous vids on the Merchantman, and as my favorite and most desired ship, admittedly, there's been a few of these vids, I've always talked about the BMM and its history, its journey, and why it was eventually put on ice by the development team. For this one, in honor of Alien Week, I felt like it would be fun to dive into the things I think would make the Merchantman more viable for the production pipeline, along with wishlisting some features that may not be possible in the game right now, but might be possible in, say, 2,000 years when CIG eventually gets around to working on the Merchantman again. But I'm not bitter. Making a whole segment for this one, but it's going to be short, don't worry. Really, I just want to say that there's a ton of content creators out there that are armchair devs that have vids of CIG should do this one thing to be successful, or this is how CIG should make ships, or CIG has to make this game loop work this one specific way that I want, or it'll fail. That's not what this vid is, or at least I hope it doesn't come off that way. Think of this more of explorations of some things that led to the Merchantman being put on ice in the first place, and a few ideas for thawing it out and maybe making something unique and cool along the way. So a little background: concepted in 2013, it finally went into production I think in 2019, and around 2022 or 2023 I think they officially announced it. I think it happened in 2022. They felt it was too complex, and with Paul Jones leaving and Squadron 42 looming large, they felt the devs' time would be better spent on other ships with more defined dependencies and a pantheon of ship and style guides kind of built on that. So you work on RSI, you can build 5 RSI ships with the accessories and stuff that you build out for the first ship, so it makes the next ship much faster to build. The Merchantman was unique, and really outside of the Defender, which doesn't really count, there isn't an asset pack for the Banu, so this was it. And honestly, I can and have gone on for hours on this subject, and I don't want to get lost in the sauce on this one, so let's dive into some of the problems and some of the solutions. Yeah, I've made a few vids on the Merchantman and why CIG put a pin on it, and why I largely agree with that decision for now, even though I retain my right to be epically bitter about it, allegedly. So here's the problems with the Merchantman and why CIG eventually snubbed it. These are all pretty well known, but they're still important for my solutions, which I'll be getting to in a bit. The first up is its size. The Merchantman was always going to be a bigger ship, even back in the original concept. Yeah, it was a blockade runner, but it was always more of a smash its way through the blockade rather than race around or through it or be stealthy. Additionally, the lore for the ship wasn't too far behind, and it stated that not only was this a trade ship with, at the time, the same cargo capacity as the Hull C, but also the Banu's ship-of-the-line warship. For whatever reason, the Banu are the only race that the Vanduul are not openly hostile towards, and you would assume if it was just about the Banu being traitors or friendly, kind of the capybaras of the universe, the Vanduul are raiders, so they would be more than likely to prey on the Banu rather than trade with them. So something in the Banu made the Vanduul go, yeah, we'll sit down and trade with you rather than just blow them up and take their stuff. As goofy and weird as the Banu are, at least so far in the lore, that at least suggests a military prowess that says, we can definitely protect our stuff, let's trade. And the Vanduul agreed with that assessment. Since the Merchantman is the only warship ever mentioned for the Banu so far, again, so far, that really suggests that it should hit really, really hard. So on top of being a big cargo mover, it also needs to be an effective warship. Later, it was decided that the Banu, being traders, in addition to the negotiation room, would also have some kind of stores or a mall inside. So cool. But the thing is now wearing at least 3 hats, maybe 4. It's a cargo mover, a trade center, a negotiation center, a warship, and as a flagship, it's already going to be big. Now, they've calmed down that cargo capacity at a later date, I think around 2019, when CIG made the shift from freight units, appropriately called FUs, to standard cargo units, or SCUs, which is what we have now, but still came out of that deal with an enormous amount of cargo, and that didn't include whatever the 8 shops were carrying in the mall. You can start to see the problem. It was turning into an everything ship. I mean, from the description, the only thing it wouldn't have been good at was racing. It was starting to get ridiculous, especially since the original concept had it something around the size of the Starfarer. Obviously, CIG needed to make a decision. Reel in its capabilities to fit its size, or grow its size to fit the purported capabilities. They went with option B, which I and other BMM owners were mostly thankful for. But that opened up a huge can of worms in the form of what the ship would be and how all that stuff would be jammed inside the ship. Added to that, while there were ideas and lore generally how the Banu acted and thought, there wasn't a lot of concept art over their architecture or style. This was fine for writing lore, but for a ship concept artist and the devs building the thing, it was a nightmare. There was no style guide, and their first stab at it was literally the most important ship of an entire species. No pressure, right? Probably at the head of the vision and concept for the Merchantman was Paul Jones. And when he checked out of CIG, it left a little bit of a hole. Now, I don't think that hole was large enough to scuttle the BMM development on its own, but certainly didn't help. I think by the time the BMM was shuffling its way through Greybox, it was becoming pretty clear that there were enough questions and honestly holes in the design and the style guide that things were getting lost in the sauce. So at the end of the day, the Banu Merchantman was huge, weird, unique, a representation of an entire species, didn't have an existing style guide, and wasn't going to lead to breakthroughs or assets for other models. There weren't other Banu ships waiting in the wings dependent on that style guide being created. And that's foreshadowing. All of those things are problems when CIG is trying to bust ships out, in addition to getting the first episode of Squadron 42 out the door. So yeah, they put a pin in the Banu Merchantman's development. So let's get into what CIG can do in the future when, and maybe before, they pick this big-ass beast up again. To start with, and I said this in my previous vid, if CIG had just plowed ahead and released the BMM as they had concepted it, as they had shown us a couple years back, just slapped some cool-ass textures on it, finalized some door animations, that sort of thing, and released it, I would have been cool with it. That said, there would probably be 20 or 30% of the ship that I'd roll my eyes at or largely avoid, intentionally or not. But as a whole, the thing was in a better state than the 600i or the Starfarer. There were just a few bits that felt a bit, God, I feel this is a little harsh, but they felt phoned in. Of course, that could be a misunderstanding on my own part, either of Banu Lore or their aesthetics, which admittedly we haven't seen much of. Mostly, I'm not sold on 2 rooms that they showed off in particular, and they feel kind of like CIG was just trying to fill space. The fact that one of these rooms, the communal living space, was being used as the style guide for the rest of the ship, well, yeah, maybe a little more time in the oven for this ship isn't a bad thing. The turret room, too, is a little too similar to the big-ass ballroom crew quarters of the 600i. In other words, they weren't sure what to do with the space, so they just left it alone as a big empty space and then a little hand-wavium that it was a contemplative pre-combat meditation chamber as you loaded yourself into the giant turret to yeet yourself some people engaged in naughtiness out in the verse. So going back to that communal living space, let's take a trip over to the only write-up we have on the Banu. Smoother Sailing in the Protectorate. Basically a treatise on the Banu race, mostly their language. For this bit, I'm going to skip over the language, which is the vast bulk of that treatise, although it is really interesting, and we're going to pop on to the part where it's talking about culture. Thankfully for this talk, the vast majority of this 387-page document is about the language, and only a couple pages are dedicated to the Banu mindset. Still, a lot can be pulled from those 2 pages. No big surprises here, but the Banu are a species that are highly focused on trade. More than that, they tend to specialize to an extreme degree. This was on display in their concept design for the Defender, which is a 2-seat fighter. Initially, CIG explained its weird little bug eyes by saying that the pilot piloted and the gunner gunned, and that the Banu wouldn't think about having a Banu pilot do both, because why would you? A specialist would be better able to do the job than a generalist. So the gunner would be able to shoot better than the pilot would be able to pilot better than the gunner. So it makes some sense. And the Banu carry that out into their Sulis, which is just kind of their word for a guild, although on a micro scale. So small g as opposed to big G. Anyways, every aspect of Banu society is governed by these Sulis, and they're kind of micro governments with interlocking contracts. So you might have one that exclusively builds roads, one that manages power distribution, another that does water, and one that specializes in trade across the stars and combat. And when I say a one, I mean 1,000. And don't worry, I'll come back to that last one, combat. The government of the Banu, the Protectorate, is very loose, with laws being mostly controlled locally. There is an overarching governmental body called the Protectorate, but they mostly just kind of help with the organization on a 10,000 foot level, and the really big things that the Banu wouldn't want any one solely being in charge of. Things like treaties, responding to disasters, offering solutions to major disagreements between major Sulis. Beyond that, Banu are more individualistic. They might be working for the greater good or advancement of Banu society as a whole, or they might just be looking out for the betterment and advancement of themselves. It's kind of chaos, but that last point is also important to the psychology of the Banu. They're still individuals. From that description, while they're loyal to the Suli they're a part of, it's obvious that some Banu are also following their own agendas and their own advancement, their own trades, if you will, or they'd never advance in a Suli. They'd never break off and form their own Suli, and there would only be one Suli in the entire Banu Protectorate. And that idea seems to throw a rock through the window of that giant communal living space. Now, having a space where the Banu crew could gather and trade and talk amongst themselves, that totally makes sense. And I'm not sure that they'd all sleep in the same room facing each other, though, with zero privacy. And I don't think they're really worried about other Banu watching them while they bang, as they all seem to be asexual, or at least gender neutral. CIG hasn't gone into that in a great deal of detail, but it does mention that these aliens are capable of gestating a child. All of them. But even if they're into big, we'll call them tree parties, I kind of think they'd still want something of their own space, if only as a place to store their personal trinkets and trade goods, things that they personally value. So I do think they would have their own rooms as opposed to having one big room where they all live. Beyond that, the Banu are very much an in the now race. They literally don't care about history, and to do so is something they'd think was weird. So while they might have a big museum like Wicklow to show off all the stuff they have acquired, and they're willing to trade, having a bunch of pictures of their great-great-grand tree, who is the greatest trader, et cetera, they wouldn't have that because it doesn't matter. So that's another key of their psychology right there. And granted, the devs that worked on the Merchantman have more info to go off of than we in the community do, certainly more than I do. So their ideas of communal living are probably more up to date than the source book they gave us a few years back. So take that as a caveat, both for me and CIG. The information we're dealing with is limited. That said, this is all make-believe, and CIG can and often does change things in the lore to fit the current narrative or the current gameplay or what they think would be fun. Nothing about the Banu is really set in stone yet, other than their language, and even that could probably change a little bit. So how does this help us create a better Merchantman? Well, let's get into that. Taking the ideas I mentioned, it seems to me that the Banu would focus a little more on displays, particularly in a ship the size of the Merchantman. Now, one thing the devs did was focus on their religiosity. They had little shrines and prayer rooms and meditation areas and that sort of thing, but they didn't really have places where you could display things. So if they were looking for a way to fill that space around the big dorsal turret, maybe make a museum, but put it on the bridge side of things, and then have a really narrow turret or a really narrow corridor leading to the turret. It's an egress point or an entrance point into the ship, and a very vulnerable one if that turret is destroyed. Having a giant room there where an enemy boarding party could stage up doesn't really make a lot of sense. Instead, I'd rather have a narrow hallway opening up into the wide open bridge so the situation is reversed in case it's ever breached. For that matter, let's talk more about Banu physiology. They're tall and thin, so it would make sense that their aesthetics would echo this. While the chairs scattered around the Merchantman were Banu scaled, it seemed like little else was. The devs could really push this by making the corridors and rooms taller and narrower than what is comfortable for a human, and it makes that space feel alien, in other words. When you walk around the Sulian, for example, it's cool, but you also feel a little uncomfortable, and that's perfect. The gray box we've seen for the Raelin is similar. It makes sense layout-wise, but it's definitely not the kind of space a human being would design to be comfortable in. They did a great job of making it feel just a little bit uncomfortable, as if an alien designed it. While the work on the Merchantman definitely had a style to it, it didn't necessarily feel completely alien. I mean, you can push it too far and people won't use the ship, but at the moment it really feels more like, say, Calatrava architecture than something made by alien hands and minds. And this brings me finally to the meat of this discussion. We need a deeper style guide for the Banu. CIG needs to figure out what this race is, how they think, but more importantly, how they design. And how do they do that? More Banu ships. CIG needs to fill out the Banu pantheon of ships. Basically, I'd say they need at least one or two smaller ships, maybe more, maybe to explore the design language and what it should be, and possibly to set themselves up with some asset packs that they could start to use to make the development of the Merchantman easier. I think we need to see a couple ships to kind of represent the species. Yeah. A medium trade ship, something the size of the Connie or MSR would make a lot of sense. Put 2 shops in it, give it just enough living space to kind of play around with some ideas, but not in a package that's so large that a wrong path wipes out months and months and months of work, like it would with a Merchantman. Maybe bust out something we haven't seen, a Banu salvager or miner, or maybe a builder, given that we're looking a couple years down the line more than likely. Basically, just fill out some smaller ships rather than going right for the main prize right out of the gates before they even understand what they're trying to build. Right now, it feels a lot like the explorations they did with the 600i of what luxury meant. they threw it together by committee and then just kind of threw up their hands and said, yeah, maybe granite walls and wide open spaces. And that's exactly what I don't want for the Merchantman. I want the space well utilized, or at least to make sense within the context of the alien species. I don't want giant communal bedrooms because they had a large, roughly circular space and said, maybe wide open spaces. I think they should take the idea of the cathedral-like cargo room and the Tree of Life and run with that. They really ran with the Tree of Life. They didn't run with the cathedral idea. So tall, narrow, grand, opulent, but use that space. That's something CIG has learned how to do over time. That spaceships built by any race will cleverly utilize space because space is limited in a spaceship. And they can learn how to do that with smaller ships in the Pantheon. So if we see a medium-sized Banu ship enter the concepts in the next year, the Trip Taker, the Sloop, whatever, that's a real good sign that the Merchantman is back on the burner. Maybe not the front burner, but a burner nonetheless. The fact that CIG is having to custom make every single asset on the Merchantman is part of the problem. Okay, so let's veer off of the most realistic solution, is that CIG needs to build those smaller ships. And let's go into things that are kind of on my wish list. These are things that I don't think CIG will do or maybe even should do, but it would be very, very, very cool, especially since we're talking at this point, if CIG were to jump back in this, I've said this before, you're probably looking at 2 to 3 years before they start work on the Merchantman again, and that's if they don't implement smaller ships. So you're probably looking at 5 to 7 years before the Merchantman actually enters the game. With that in mind, CIG is going to be advancing their tech, and there's going to be a lot more in. So we might have more realistic options for some of these things at a later date than we do now, which is another reason why Jared often says you want your ship to be last in line to be made, not first. So first off, let's talk about layout and modularity. In the previous section, I talked about one of the major problems CIG had with the Merchantman was the fact that it was an everything ship. It's a mall, it's a cargo hauler, it's a big hangar, it's a battleship, and yeah, that's a problem. I mean, sure, you could have a Merchantman that does all those things, but the way the Banu Sulis specialize, does that really make sense with the species? So here we go. Modularity. Again, if the Merchantman is on ice, we're not really constrained by what CIG is limited to now. But by the time the Galaxy drops, probably next year, they should have a pretty good handle on modular ships. And we can expect there'll probably be a couple other large modular ships in the mix as well, like the aforementioned 600i, whose rework has been languishing in purgatory along with the Merchantman. The Banu are specialists, so why not specialize? I think there are definitely some core features of the Merchantman, and the fact that these are generational ships handed down through families for generations might lead to ships that are generalist, but there should also be options out there that are highly specific. So let's say the base Merchantman is the one that we saw. Cathedral-like cargo bay, 8-shop mall, big bridge, big dorsal turret, goo pits. Seriously, dump the medbed and just have goo pits, CIG. It makes sense that aliens would have different healing tech. Anyways, where was I? Right, the standard layout, the default. But what if there were other options? Like you have a few core rooms connected by corridors that don't change, but then there's options for large sections of the ship to be specialized. But here's the kicker. A player would select what module or modules they want, but then it would be locked in. They'd never be able to switch those modules out for other ones after they locked them in. I would think the rooms that would be locked in, like always, every Banu Merchantman has this, would be probably the bridge, the negotiation room, crew quarters, which I still think there should be individual rooms, but the communal living space is a good place for those rooms to open up into. But beyond that, make the remaining space modular. For example, the cargo bay could instead be a big hangar for a light Banu fighter fighters, which again don't exist yet. But if CIG fills out the Pantheon, they should. Remember that the Banu Defender is a heavy fighter, not a light fighter. It's a long range one. It makes sense that they'd have little dart-like ships or even snubs. Alternatively, the hangar could be replaced with stacked cells for Banu slavers, which we know are a thing. Or they could be a refinery. You get the idea. Make it something like a Banu galaxy, but much larger. You could also push this further by having, say, 3 different layouts. And by a layout, I mean the corridors leading between the big modular spaces. So let's say that you would have 5 options for the big room: cargo bay, additional hangar, refinery, passenger, prisoner, living quarters, medical facilities, and I don't know, something science related eventually. And then for external options, maybe bigger guns that eat into that internal space. So if you go with bigger guns or alien torpedoes, missiles, all of that would come at the cost of those other rooms like the hangar and the cargo bay. So you'd have these big rooms that would be on a theme, the generalized standard base form, and then the option to go with one of these modules. But once you selected it, it would be baked in. The Merchantman would only be modular on creation. So think of it more of an endeavor, but once you picked what it did, that was baked in. And yeah, that's a pretty big risk for both CIG and the player. And to get around this, CIG could eventually make it so the player could change up their ship at a future date, but they'd have to go to Banu space, and it would be extremely cost and probably time prohibitive. But this way, you could both lean into the Banu mindset of specializing, as well as explain some of the wide capabilities of this ship. Maybe even bake in some external options to capture that spiky version of the original concept, like this one that Astro Chronicles mocked up a couple years back. And I'm putting a link here because that thing looks amazeballs. I mean, look at this thing. Go over there, give them a sub and a like on this video because yeah, that's pretty amazing. But anyway, what's more, you could have 3 layouts. These would be the corridors connecting these main rooms, both the standard ones and the modular ones. I'm thinking 3 because you could have a layout that utilizes small spaces, a layout that utilizes medium spaces, and a layout that uses large spaces. So you actually could have one that, as opposed to having small individual crew rooms, actually does have like a big communal space where the Banu live, depending on what the purpose of that ship is or what the player is envisioning with that room. And this is where we can get really crazy. And this is something CIG would obviously never do. But again, there's a wish listing section. It would be cool if you could then go in and select what these smaller rooms did. Again, I wouldn't think there'd be a lot of these rooms, even if they were the small versions, but it would help kind of solidify that unique feel the Merchantman should have. Storage rooms, guest cabins, shielded cargo storage, extra computers, museum rooms or display rooms. I don't know. I'm kind of counting on the whole modular thing to being a cost-saving thing for CIG in the future. You don't need devs working for years on a single ship if you can get them working on a single room for a month or 2. What's more, this could also do 2 other things. Make the ship feel unique, make each ship feel unique, but also make it so that it would seem like the ship had evolved over time. Maybe you have a combat ship filled with smaller medical bays, or a prison ship with science rooms. You get the idea. There might be some weird combinations here. But again, once a player selected these and accepted their creation, that's it. It's baked in, and that's what they'll have when they're flying around the verse. They won't be changing those things out, at least not with a simple button click. Again, changing the modular room should be extremely time consuming and expensive, and have to be done in a Banu facility. You might be without your merchantman for a month or even months, depending on what you're changing out. So right there, you have modularity in a few large spaces for the overall theme of the ship. Its primary game loop, if you will. 3 choices of an internal layout, and then choices for the smaller rooms on those layouts. If CIG can reuse asset packs and don't have to individually make each curve on the ship, then it opens options up like this. With that many parts, you could have a situation where very few merchantmen are the same on the inside, making them fun to explore, board, visit, and live on. And I mean, okay, again, obviously they're never going to do this, but again, part of the fun of Star Citizen, even since the early days, is speculation and dreaming, at least for me, and I hope for you too. This project would have never been started if it wasn't for dreaming of a better space game, and here we are. So if we're going to be waiting a long time for the Merchantman, and it's sure looking like that'll be the case, we might as well wait for something good. I think even if CIG just does minor tweaks on what they already have, I'll be happy. Maybe not as happy as if they implemented the things I just mentioned, but honestly, this is a computer game. I'm not actually living on this thing. As I've said before, I think my tune will be all right when I log off for the night, but I hope CIG swings for the fences on this thing. These are just some ideas for CIG before they start working on this thing the next time in its eventual release, shortly before the heat death of the universe, but I'm not bitter. Anyways, what are some of your ideas for the Merchantman, or like different ships they could have in the pantheon below it? Love to hear your thoughts on this, on my ideas and your ideas. So other than that, catch you next time.